Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Daily Medieval Podcast. Today, I'm joined by not a usual guest. I've interviewed writers and historians and archaeologists, but today we go towards stage and screen as we're joined with the creator of Henry VIII Used to Hate Us. So please welcome Ryan Gilmartin.
Hey everybody, and hey Luke, great to meet you all.
Oh, wonderful for coming on. So I guess before we jump into the sort of play itself, I'd love to know a bit about yourself and your journey to where you are now. So sort of what inspired you to sort of be who you are today?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. So I'm an actor and a writer, but I've always loved history, I should say. And ironically, I did way better in my history A level than I did in my drama A level. And yet I've carried on one professionally and one I haven't. So make of that what you will. And maybe I suppose that leads us to why I'm making a play about it. So yeah, I kind of originally was quite narrow, like kind of went to drama school, came out as just an actor, and then kind of branched out into writing as well. Really love kind of, for me, like scratching that itch. Because often as an actor, when you get into a rehearsal room, for example, a lot of decisions are already made for you. So someone says like, this is your costume, Luke. And like, Luke, this is the set you're walking on. And you're like, oh, right, okay. They're like, well, you just learn the lines, right? And create the character. And there's a lot of creativity in that, but there's also not a lot of creativity in that because you're kind of, you're especially, I suppose the West End would be a very exaggerated example where you're very much like one kind of peg in a massive kind of thing. And so I've always felt that need to kind of scratch that itch. And I was thinking today about history and about kind of why I'm into history. And I think for me, as an actor, whenever you get a role, you often do a lot of contextual research. So at drama school, we were doing things like Chekhov, which is such, I mean, I think it's still on the curriculum, right? The Russian period. You do the whole of it, right? You do like Stalin, and you do like the Tsar, and like, so that stuff was mad. And so doing Chekhov at drama school was incredible for that. And I suppose for me, I like molding that kind of the history context, but then making it practical or useful, or because an actor, you're kind of going from reading it and digesting it into kind of now making it alive. And I suppose that's what I was like, oh, that makes sense why I'm doing both things. Like as an actor, I love history, and then performing history enables me to kind of put the two things together and kind of fuse them into a living, breathing thing. Yeah.
Oh, super. So then what led you to then create this play in particular?
So actually it was kind of kickstarted maybe 10 years ago. I went to drama school and I met a lot of other people. I think if you'd asked me like age 20, like, oh, where are you from? I probably would have lied and said that I'm from like near Peterborough. And if people didn't know where that was, I would say, oh, I'm from near Cambridge. If they didn't really know where that was, I'd say, oh, well, like, do you know London? I'm about 100 miles away from there. And I was like, one day I was walking through Tesco's in the sausage section. I was like, oh, Lincolnshire sausages. And I was like, this is weird that like the only thing, if I'm feeling nostalgic or homesick, the only thing I've got are Lincolnshire sausages. And then I was like, right, I've got to be known for something. Like everyone's comes from somewhere, right? I had a friend from Yorkshire who they call Alleyways Ginnells, and there's this great Yorkshire folk song called On Ilkley Moor Bartat. And I was like, oh, cool. I love a bit of that. I love a bit of a sense of identity. And so, yeah, just went kind of on YouTube and kind of got into some local history books. And as you know, when you read, especially books that, one leads to another, right? They'll reference a book and I'll say, oh, in so-and-so's book. And then you go and read so-and-so's book and it kind of leads on there. And so originally my big creative dream is to create a TV series about the drainage of the Fens from the perspective of a female eel catcher. And I suppose with the historical, we don't know if that's true. We don't know if there was female eel catchers or not. I would say it doesn't really matter. And I did a lot of research for kind of that series and kind of a lot of folklore, and then from there then I found out about the history of the Henry VIII thing quite late. I was like, oh, what's this thing about Henry VIII? Like that wasn't the initial thought when I first got into local history. And then I had these maybe 3 other stories. I had about 10 originally. So maybe about 3 years ago, I was going to some workshops and I was like, right, I've got these 10 kind of almost like facts that were just like a one-liner. And I was like, which ones are you most interested in? And these are the ones that people were saying, oh, make these 4 part of the show. Okay. So the Henry VIII thing is kind of, I'm always just like what's relevant to people and what's that popular reference. A lot of us do hit Henry VIII at primary school. And so luckily we had this lovely link between a national figure and also something local. And I was like, well, there's a link. Like, how does a national figure tie into Lincolnshire? So yeah, we lead with that story. It's almost like the clickbait headline, that one. But there's three other really exciting stories in that as well.
Well, it's interesting because obviously, as you say, when you think of Henry VIII, it's typically, you think of like Six, the musical. You've got like the wives of Henry VIII and everything. But this is sort of a different angle. So I'd love to could you give a bit of a synopsis of what these stories are then that you explore?
Yes, this is what I love about being on a history podcast. I can dive a little bit deeper than
Yes.
than I can normally. Yes. So and this is also where I say to everyone, I'm not a historian. So I sit in this kind of weird space of I like history, love it, but I'm also I'm not a professor, not quite qualified. So yes, the Henry VIII story relates to this thing called the Lincoln Uprising, which is also part of a bigger movement called the Pilgrimage of Grace, which also happened in Yorkshire. You guys, this is great. I can just go straight into it. I don't have to give too much context. So as you know, with the Reformation, one of the side effects was the dissolution of the monasteries, which was a kind of a cash grab. Now, a lot of kind of more, not of that say normal people, these are people who had a little bit of money still. If you had a family heirloom, you would kind of keep it in the church in the same way you'd kind of probably keep money in a bank today. I don't know if it quite had the FCS protection on it, but maybe the churches said, hey, if things go wrong, maybe that was it, like instead of someone breaking into your house and stealing it, they're like, we'll keep it in the church, in this secret vault. And so a lot of kind of normalish people were worried about, maybe that silver cup that had been passed down their family. And when Henry VIII was starting to dissolve the monasteries, people were like, hang on, there was rumours that he was also going to start dissolving churches, and it was become, much more granular. So people started to worry. There was this also was touched on in the latest series of Wolf Hall, of which I had an audition weirdly. So there's a character from Lincoln was going to come and deliver this news. I was like, this is crazy. So this was like last year. So I'd already written the first draft of the play. I was like, this is me. This is what I've been studying. So it's all about that. There was a lot of fear. The groups of people get together in Louth and Horncastle, and the movement grows to about 20,000 people, and then very quickly, probably in the course of about a week, they go to Lincoln Cathedral. They storm the cathedral. They take over the cathedral, and there's about 40,000 people. We think in and around Lincoln Cathedral, which I did a bit of Googling, 40,000 people is about 2% of England's population at the time.
Right.
And I think that as a historian, we see numbers, and I think it's always really interesting to go 40,000 today is, people go, that's a football stadium. But yeah, 40,000 then was a lot more people, and would have felt like a much bigger thing. Yeah, 2% of the population. So that's what that is about. We kind of capture this in the play. There's two schools of thought about, so you're in the cathedral, what should we do next? Do we keep on rolling? Do we keep on right, well, this has gone really well. Let's take over the whole place. Because really it was just a protest movement. It was really about kind of saying, we're really concerned about this thing. It was definitely not about overthrowing the monarchy. It was just saying, can you guarantee that you'll protect our goods in these churches, that you're not going to come for the church? That was all it was, really. Now, the gentry get involved as well. I suppose any rebel movement, there's always kind of more working class, but also more gentry as well. And the two kind of need each other in a strange way. The gentry are like, hey, what we normally do with these things, guys, is write a letter. So the gentry say, look, let's write a letter to the king and say, these are our demands. That's how we do things properly. If you've got to have a revolt, you've got to do it properly. Some people are skeptical. They're like, no, we need to keep moving. Let's keep going. Really now the letter is kind of it's like a warning. So they choose to, rather than carry on, they choose to send a letter to Henry VIII. The letter gets to Henry VIII, and it basically gives him enough time. It kind of puts the brake on the movement. Henry VIII hears about it, and he sends an army. Because of where it is, Lincoln, your nearest army was kind of Norfolk way it would have been. Okay. Which again, that's probably a couple of days march. So it really bought them time. So then the letter comes back. It says, hey, there's an army coming to you guys. What are you going to do? And they were like, well, this isn't a violent movement. So everyone kind of disperses. But they get about 50 of kind of ringleaders of that movement, and they kind of hang them all. But for, I suppose, a kind of treason. But within that letter, so Henry VIII sends a letter, which we feature part of in the show, which I think is extremely, even today, you'd be like, whoa, that's way too far for someone to say, but it really gives you a mindset of how Henry VIII saw this place, and probably how other people saw the place. So he describes it as, the most brute and beastly in the realm. So this is part of what he says in the letter. He says, I have never read, heard, or known that princes, councillors, and prelates should be appointed by rude and ignorant common people, nor that they, the ignorant common people, have the ability to discern and choose sufficient counsellors for a priest. How presumptuous then are you, the rude commons of one shire, and that one the most brute and beastly of the whole realm, to find fault with your prince. And lastly, he kind of ends, sirs, remember your traitorous actions, and shame not your native country of England. I charge you to withdraw to your own houses every man, and submit yourself to such punishment as I think you worthy of. For doubt you not that I will not suffer this injury at your hands unrevenged.
Ooh,
So that's how the Lincoln Uprising was quelled.
that is fantastic. Yeah, that's cool. That's a very interesting one because it's sort of one of the things that I've looked at in the past through research, and that is this idea of feudalism. And it's a difficult thing to conceptualize because a lot of people will say, the king is subject to the people. And so to then see this sort of letter and the way he then, talks about, these sort of common peasants in this, as you say, yeah, that's wow, that's a super interesting letter. Yeah,
It's got kind of parallels to voting today, even. Obviously now we have that system where, common people vote, people of power, but, we got some people would say, well, once they're in, they then don't have to do much for 3.5 years. And I thought, wow, you could almost imagine someone like Boris Johnson saying that behind closed doors kind of thing about someone. So, yeah, we then, in the show, we kind of, Henry VIII kind of like merges into this kind of Boris Johnson-esque figure. So, yeah, if you come see the show, you'll see how that manifests. But yeah, I was trying to draw the link between kind of the past and the present, I suppose, really.
Oh, fantastic. But what's interesting, I think, is that if I'm correct, is that you feature a couple of saints in the show. And obviously that is of particular interest.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could just, obviously, you've spoken about folklore and that previously, how this all ties in, these idea of saints.
Yeah, so the two saints in the show are Saint Guthlac, who I'm sure historians will know. He's in the British Library. There's a whole thing called the Guthlac Roll, and it's these incredible kind of 12 images of kind of what he got up to, really, in the Fens. And then he has his sister called St. Pega. And it's funny, you interviewed Sharon recently about women's history. Well, this Story really sums it up. So I'll give you a little snapshot. So they originally from Mercia, these two people. So both of them, Guthlac and Pega. Pega always knew she wanted to be a nun. So that was very much what she was destined for and what she was really, really into. Guthlac kind of is a soldier. So as a young man, he kind of serves in kind of Ireland and Flanders, and then comes back to England as well. He does that for about 8 years. And then he decides, hey, I want to convert to God. And I want to do what you're doing, Pega. And so straight away, I was really interested in that. Like, if that's real life, but like today, how would that feel? You've got your brother who, especially in a patriarchal world, would have been, the apple of your dad's eye, I'm sure. You go off to a nunnery and maybe they forget about you a little bit. And and I was like, I can't imagine how that would have felt for Pega, how that feels. This guy kind of very much makes a massive U-turn and decides he wants to become a hermit. And especially when you get to the end of the story, it's got extra resonance. So as you know, the whole Jesus in the desert thing, you want to see yourself, in the medieval period, people are really into that. They're like, how can we get that own experience? I want that kind of hermit experience. And depending on where you were in the UK, that would look differently. So if you're in Wales, you might go up to a mountain or a cave, things like that. We don't really have any deserts in that part of the world, in East Anglia. So, but there was this place, there's this big fen. And he was like, hey, great, let's go to the fens. And they go to this place called Crowland, which at the time was called Croyland. And this is when we start to kind of see a bit of the Guthlac Roll. They get this boat, this guy kind of guides them through the marshes. And there's this beautiful bit of like much older history where they land on this kind of island, which is like a burial mound of, I suppose, I don't really know what it might be. It's pretty old. It's like an ancient burial mound. Nice. I suppose it might have been like Saxon, maybe even something before that. Yeah. And they kind of take shelter in this burial mound. And quite quickly this thing gets rolling. Guthlac becomes quite famous. People come visit him. It's all going well. Now, Guthlac's shtick is that he is there to fight demons, and again you see this in the Guthlac Roll. So the official line is that Guthlac he's encountering these demons, he's kind of dispelling them. There's some incredible images. Really recommend you check them out. Of They're kind of all around him. They're very impish. So a little bit like the Lincoln Imp in kind of art style. He's like pulling things out of these demons through their mouths. He's like using sticks, and it's, yeah. But there's some great accounts of he himself being like dragged through the marsh by these demons, and he's got these scratches all over his body. That's the official line of kind of what's going on. That's how he makes his name, and so people come see him for that. And again, all the time I'm thinking, well, that, if you're his sister, like he can see these things, and we assume Pegger can't. It's never written that she can see these things. And when you add that to the historical context, that if it wasn't the official line, because I always love this kind of, people might say it's revisionist history, but maybe it's not. Obviously the area at the time had malaria, so he could actually be suffering from fever, extreme fever, and kind of seeing these things. There is also a line that he's maybe taken some very early form of opium to counter these malaria side effects, which also can make you hallucinate. And lastly, there's also a theory that actually he's encountering like the very early Britons who may have still been hanging around, which is like the fourth theory. And then kind of what happens very much in that kind of Jesus in the desert thing, one of these demons says, look, your sister is going to tempt you to break your fast. Obviously as a hermit, that's his whole thing. He ate very little. And he was like, right, okay, like, so just them two have been living together. It's very kind of, well, not intimate, but like, yeah, you're very close. Like, it's literally just you two in the middle of nowhere, and he sends her away, and he never sees her again until he dies. So like they're apart for 20 years. Yeah. Now she kind of goes essentially up the road today. It would have been a much harder journey then, but she establishes a place of worship in a place called Peakirk. And there's a link there, like the Peakirk thing kind of relates to her name. So I can't quite remember, but it's like Pegger something, and it gets kind of compressed to Peakirk. But at the core of it, I was like, this is a really human story between a brother and a sister. The sister who always wanted this life of kind of worship and was like, hey, this is my thing. He comes in, converts, maybe dubiously, gets all the glory. He ends up in the British Library, and she... this is true, actually. I can't quite remember where it was, but there's some kind of British Book of Saints, right? And you go to the entry where it says Pegger, and it just says C. Guthlac.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, that's like a real... Yeah. So I was like, great. And so we tell the story in the show from Pegger's perspective. Right. So in the show, it was very sad. So like a week before he died, roughly, he sends a message to Pegger. Yeah. Pegger doesn't get there in time, so she arrives when he's dead. And I restart it from there, of like, yeah, it all just comes out. There's kind of frustration about him, but also mourning, and she's dealing with a lot of different things. And in this very kind of human thing of like, well, why could you see the things that I couldn't? And that very deeply thing about, does that mean you're more holy than me? So yeah, it's kind of everything. It's like brother, sister, jealousy. Am I worthy enough? Like doubt. It's got all those things going on. So that's what their story is. Do you know much about them too?
So it's interesting. So I'll say, firstly, what's interesting is I've never come across. I've come across plenty of examples of when a child in a family becomes quite holy, and the family sort of rejects it. They say that you should be getting married, you should be living this sort of formal life. I've seen it where a wife has sort of converted her husband. So there's a brilliant woman called Mary de Oyne who created the Beguines, which was this sort of holy order of women. And she lived a very traditional life, like she would sleep on a plank of wood and stuff like that to sort of have this sort of suffering, and she sort of converted her husband to that. But I've never seen siblings rise in that sort of way and then have this sort of jostle. So that's a really interesting sort of story in that case. Now, Saint Guthlac I have come across because I don't know if you know his sort of semi-connection to Beowulf.
No.
So Beowulf was written in East Anglia and was essentially based on this idea of people going into the fens and fighting demons. So it was sort of, as you say, that idea of the 40 days in the desert. People would go into the fens, go into these sort of really dark, mysterious areas, these really swampy areas, and just get absolutely like riled up and fight their own demons, fight demons, whatever it may have been, and that sort of then leads to the conception of Beowulf, where he then goes into the these swampy caves, these fens to fight Grendel.
So,
So it's
Luke, are we saying here, is it a bit like St. George, where the Beowulf story comes first, and then we have this kind of Christian story added onto it?
it's sort of a I mean, do you know, that's an interesting one. I don't know enough to say that, but I mean, it was Beowulf was written in what we would say is the Middle Ages. It was written sort of potentially in around the year 1000, maybe a little bit earlier, around 800, which is sort of contemporary to Saint Guthlac. Um, but it was in a time of Christianization, and it is this sort of just picking up this story of this sort of Viking world, but it was written in medieval Christian England. No, so it's really fascinating that how you've
And also for any gamers, the Fens features in one of the Assassin's Creed games.
of course,
You know
yes.
that? Yeah, yeah, yeah. I watched like a playthrough of it, and it wasn't completely faithful. As someone who lives in the Fens, I was like, yeah, it's okay. It's like generic swampy. I wasn't like, wow, they've really captured the Fens here. So
Oh no, I totally get you. It's the same with. I'm in Norwich, so was very keen to check out Thetford in the game, and it was not quite like Thetford in real life, but there we go. So super interesting stories, and all of which are within this county that is often overlooked. So it's a really interesting thing to look at the history of Lincolnshire, and it seems like it's a history that, as you say, is often overlooked. And one of the aspects that I believe you look at is things like folklore, food, and music, and sort of the fascinating traditions that come from this place. So I wondered if you could speak more on that and how you feature those in the play.
yeah, so the folklore thing is really interesting because I suppose there's a very literal version of folklore, which is a folk tale that is kind of not really based in history at all and is just passed along orally. And then I'm speaking this week at a Lincolnshire folklore tale symposium at Nottingham Trent University, which is very exciting, but also maybe feels a bit intimidating. And I said, hey, listen, like a lot of the stuff that I do is kind of like part history, a little bit of folklore. And they were like, well, actually, a folklore can be that. It's where the history kind of gets attached to. I suppose King John's Treasure is a great example of that. There's a little bit of history. There's not much, and as a result, because that lack of history, we start to embellish. And every time that history gets told, it gets changed, it gets added on, and kind of merges. A bit like what we said with Guthlac and the Beowulf story. So the folklore that is in it's more like there's a lot of folklore around the show that kind of really informed it. I suppose actually a good example of folklore and working class history is probably the Fen Tigers, because this is a group of people that are really not documented. I've just recently read Imperial Mud, which is very much all about this book. And yeah, you only really hear about them through court accounts or when they're arrested or there's arrest warrants. But they're kind of this slightly kind of mystical, mysterious group that lasted for about 250 years. We know roughly there's some really interesting parallels with the Luddite movement. And it's probably the Fen Tigers, and so obviously the key thing of the Luddite movement was this idea of captain and lieutenant, which would kind of protect your identity. So you'd be like, captain. Well, it wouldn't even be Captain Daly; it would be like, Captain whoever. And that started like the Fen Tigers are doing that a little bit before. But mainly we know it's mainly female led. But often the whole community would come out and oppose something. A lot of it was done in the dark. And as a result, you can riff on that about kind of the extent of what they did. It has that kind of folklore quality. So within the show, there's kind of nothing that is kind of completely folklore. Like, for example, like, the Bayard's Leap photo. There's nothing quite like that. But kind of on the fringes of it, like I said, I'm developing this TV series. So there's a lot of folklore that has kind of like, I suppose, is on the fringes and has informed how I created it. So there's a great folklore that I love about witches' shells or eggs, breaking eggs. Have you heard of that one?
No, I haven't. No, what's the?
So this is a beautiful little bit of text. Yeah, so it has this kind of beautiful bit of prose about it. So basically, you should always, back in the day, you're boiling an egg. Once you've eaten it, you should always break the eggshells because there's this great folklore that goes like this. Never leave your eggshells unbroken in the cup. Think of us poor sailor men and always smash them up. For witches come and find them and sail away to sea and make a lot of misery for mariners like me. They call up all the tempests from Davy Jones's store and blow us into waters where we haven't been before. And when the masts are falling in splinters on the wrecks, the witches climb the rigging and dance upon the decks. And I thought, kind of, especially with this TV series I want to do, I've got this idea that the kind of the female fisher person is kind of probably has an uneasy marriage with her husband, as a lot of people probably did at this period. It's not really about love, as we know. It's convenience, or well, I suppose in a way you could say that. Well, I don't know who had it better off, really, working people or kind of nobility. It's a very similar situation of, for those in nobility, there's a lot more politics going on, whereas locally it's more like, hey, I'm getting on a bit, which I suppose in medieval times was like, you're 21. Or probably not even that, 18, and they're like, hey, we need to settle down with, Luke from the village, it's not a big place. And so, yeah, there was a lot of these kind of, what we assume are these kind of compromised marriages. And so in this story, I'm like, yeah, her husband's at sea. And I was like, oh, I bet she's trying to kind of bump him off, really. She doesn't want him to come home. And so in my mind, she would use this kind of folklore to kill him. And that's something that I want to feature quite early in the series. So there's a lot of stuff that's kind of featured. I love the Hand of Glory, which is a slightly more darker kind of bit of folklore, which is, I suppose, so those two ones are, I suppose whenever I'm looking at folklore, I've always got my writer's hat on and going, right, which ones would really work on stage or on screen, which on, obviously a lot of folklore is quite non-verbal, which is great for screen. Yeah. If it's someone saying something backwards or they're doing something that today is very odd. They might be walking backwards. They might be placing something under their pillow. They might be throwing something over their shoulder. It's all stuff that makes you go like, a modern ones would go like, what's going on there? Like, why are they doing that? So yeah, I think it's such a rich resource as a writer.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, folk, especially, like I've been looking at folklore in the Middle Ages recently, and there's some absolutely incredible things out there. And it shows that, when you get to that individual sort of boots on the ground look at things, rather than sort of kings or popes or whatever it may be, folklore was really heavily present amongst these sort of general populations. And there's some absolutely brilliant ones. The one I was looking at recently was in across France, that people were sort of really concerned about these aerial sailors who were coming in these airships across from this mythical kingdom. And the reason being was they were terrified of basically sort of storms were damaging crops. So the only way they could sort of rationalize it was this so-called like aerial sailors. And so farmers would leave a portion of their crop for these sailors to pick up so they wouldn't ruin the rest. And this bishop goes around, it's sort of by Lyon, and he's absolutely tormented by this. He says the only one who can control the weather is God, and nothing else. So pack it in, kind of thing. But that's the element that I find really interesting about folklore that it can give us is like with the witches thing that you said there is these individual beliefs that really everyone else has to sort of jostle with, especially when you look at like the church and different things like that.
Yeah, I got into folklore, like, it's funny, I was discovering these tales before COVID, and you read a lot of, often at the end of a folklore book, it'll say, by about World War One, folklore was dying out because the village suddenly met the whole world, and those beliefs are quite hard to hold in. Just they couldn't really be held together anymore. And it's like, we know we can, the faith of, the gender of your baby before it's born. Science has kind of made things, it's just taken a lot of the mystery out of life. However, obviously we've all just gone through a pandemic, and there was definitely moments in that pandemic where there wasn't answers. Everyone was kind of saying, well, I wonder if we can like not lock down in a few months or a few weeks or a year, and everyone's kind of making their own kind of just out of thin air theories about as a way of getting a sense of control. And you're like, and so now post COVID, when you read these folklores again, you're like, actually, we've just been through a period of massive kind of uncertainty, and you get it. And I think, as we know, like like new age and a real interest in folk ritual has never gone away. But I think definitely post-COVID, you're seeing a lot more of these events and rituals coming up because people are like, this makes sense of my life and what I've gone through. And there is unknowns. And obviously science itself is this beautiful thing where I think someone said science is a bit like a religion, you know, like it isn't fixed. And I think you could argue history isn't fixed as well, which is kind of what's great about it.
Oh, super. And I love that way in which, as you said before, connecting that past to present. And I wonder, have you, through going all of this and building this story and creating this play, have you become more attached or sort of built your relationship with your own sort of local history and your own past?
Yeah, 100%. And that's the kind of almost a bit like Guffer, like I feel converted, you know, in a way. And I want to kind of give that to more people, especially young people, because like I said, I felt quite lost when I went away. And I think, like I said, this area doesn't do a great job of telling its own history, or the references they do use don't explain things like the drainage of the fens, for example. Like in year 6, I went to a pumping station. And so what you're seeing is like, kind of like, I'm trying to think if I'm doing this presentation on Friday or when you talk about the drainage of fens, often it's done quite factually. It'd be like, Vermeulen wanted to do 1, 2, 3. He'd do the Bedford level, this, and it was going to divert water down. And I was like, well, you wouldn't explain like today and the internet to someone by showing them a diagram of how the internet works. You wouldn't be like, there's a computer and it plugs into a router. The router, like, that would not help someone understand internet culture, or it does a terrible job of explaining it. And I think that's kind of what I mean about the drainage of the fens. Is like, it's here, like it's super flat. You drive around. I suppose this idea of like, you know, especially a young person, you get in the bus to school, being driven to school, you're like, God, this place is like a bit bleak. Like, why does it look like this? And then no one says, oh, because of the drainage. Well, they say drainage of fens, but like, what does that mean? Like, for me, the bit I'm interested in is the social side, the people side, this big movement, this protest movement, the Fen Tigers, this unique way of life that was created by that landscape. And I go, actually, it's right here. There's a great line in the play. Like the landscape, like the history in the landscape is not flat, it's flat pack. You got to build it yourself.
Nice.
You know, and I kind of talk about that. And that's, I suppose, the journey I've been on. I'm really trying to pass that on to more people, that sense of identity. And so this show in particular, we did a mini version of it in 2023, and it was a bit more factual. Say factual. People came away saying, oh, that's interesting, or that's intriguing. And now I'm like, I want to move them more. So if you come to see the show in June, it's much more emotive, and you're going to go on that emotional roller coaster that I suppose the area itself has been on, which for me is a sense of revolution and individual identity in a place that is quite violent and dangerous and all that rich stuff that we love. And then it kind of becomes this kind of pacified, neutral, like this kind of myth that nothing ever happens here. It gets like tattooed onto the county's face almost. Yeah. And we end a bit more hopefully, but yeah, we're going to kind of take people on that journey so they feel the history rather than just go, oh, I found some facts out about this.
Oh, fantastic. It sounds like a really fantastic, interesting play. And I do hope that everyone is able to see it. So, I mean, how can we signpost people to it?
Yes, so it's going to happen in June. The best way right now, we're kind of a couple weeks out from creating a ticket link. So if you're super interested, if you've got social media, you can follow me on there, which is ryan.gilmartin1 on Instagram. I've also got a website, which is ryangilmartin.co.uk, and I have a little newsletter you can subscribe to. We are kind of, as part of it, we are going to invite history vloggers. So if you follow people like the History Magpie, he's going to come and watch the show and kind of and do a video about it. So if you're kind of already in that history sphere, you might see it from people that you follow and enjoy. But yes, it's kind of, I'll name the places very quickly. So it's going to tour to, this is not in order, Spalding, Holbeach, Boston, Peterborough, Lincoln, Coningsby, so Tattershall Castle, Newark, and Grimsby. So if you've got friends in those areas, or you can make it along to those dates, definitely. Especially if you're more East Anglia way, then I suppose somewhere like the Peterborough date. We've also got Whittlesea booked, but we're working on a date for that one. So it's even closer if you live that way. And it's taking place just in June, starts in mid-June and ends at the end. And I suppose the four components in the show, there's live music. So the two guys, they're a folk duo themselves called Dipper Malkin, who love, like, I'm going to butcher what it is. It's like early English music. like which I know is a whole subsection of history in itself. So they love that, and they're incredible musicians. They've played on like the Hobbit soundtrack, for example, things like
Oh
that.
wow.
Then we've got some local foods. We've got Lincolnshire poacher cheese and Lincolnshire plum bread. We did want to get sausages, but in June, keeping like 100 sausages cold and not killing everybody was going to be tricky. So, but we're going to share a little story about Lincolnshire sausages because I mean, this is great. Kind of food history is a whole thing that I've kind of really fallen in love with. Yeah, the sage that's in the sausage really does tell you a bit of a history of the area and the climate of it and how it ended up there. Yes, so there's that. So there's food, there's folklore, there's folk, and there's kind of like history. So if you're a pure history buff, you'll love it as well. And hopefully you'll be inspired by we're working really hard to get a real range of people in the audience. So you'll see some younger people from schools. So I say it's appropriate for anyone about 10 plus.
Yeah.
So like, it's like a little bit like horror history, but kind of a bit more darker and definitely has that kind of young adult or kind of just adult feel about it. So because of the stories and how it's presented. So it won't feel like a show for 5-year-olds, but it also won't feel like a lecture.
Oh, super. Well, thank you so much for coming. It sounds like an absolutely amazing play. And there you have it, everyone. Thank you for watching. And that is Ryan Gilmartin.
Thanks, Luke.
Wonderful. Thank you.
No
There we
worries.
go. I see we've got less than a minute, so it might drop off at any point. But thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
No, it was an absolute